While Indigenous education has come a long way since colonial times, the perpetuation of attainment gaps indicates there is still a long way to go. In 1814, the Native Institution was established to instruct Aboriginal students in academic and practical skills that equipped them to work for white settlers. It incorporated a boarding school to house Indigenous children removed from their families. In the mission period of the 1830s, churches and missions assumed responsibility for schools. They taught academic and employment skills, but their focus was to teach Christianity and assimilate the Aboriginal children into white society. The Board of National Education began in 1848, but it excluded Aboriginal children, stating that it was impractical to educate them. In 1880, the Public Instruction Act introduced free, compulsory, non-religious education for all children. Only 15% of Indigenous children enrolled in schools, however, as school principals could exclude them based on their race. In 1883, the Aboriginal Protection Board introduced segregation of Indigenous people onto government reserves and into Aboriginal schools. In 1937, the assimilation period introduced assimilation of all individuals who were not identified as a being of full Aboriginal blood. In 1963, the Aboriginal Education Consultative Committee allowed Aboriginal communities to provide input into educational planning, and from 1972, school principals could no longer exclude Indigenous students based on their race. In 1982, the first Aboriginal education policy was introduced, and by 1987 it was mandatory to incorporate this policy into school curriculums. Many schools, however, did not cooperate with local Indigenous communities or incorporate the policy into their curriculums. So in 1989, the federal government introduced the National Aboriginal Education Policy. The government ensured the policy strategies were implemented by tying them to government funding. In 2010, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Education Action Plan highlighted the areas requiring improvement to close educational gaps, but by 2020, only 2 of these targets had been achieved. Historical policies stifled Indigenous initiative, perpetuated cycles of government dependency, and contributed to economic and social disadvantage. Education must address community needs to rectify this. Specialised teacher training has been introduced to teach cultural awareness and enable teachers to support Indigenous students. Increased cultural sensitivity and the use of Indigenous resources contributes to the affirmation of cultural identity in Indigenous students and encourages understanding in non-Indigenous students. Educational recommendations introduced by the National Aboriginal Education Policy in 1995 are now incorporated into school curriculums. The recommendations include the National Indigenous English Literacy and Numeracy Strategy and the Education Strategic Initiatives Program that work towards the achievement of literacy and numeracy skills in Indigenous students that are comparable to non-Indigenous students. All Australian states and territories have established Indigenous education committees for consultation on education matters and to act as advisors to policy and program writers. Targeted Indigenous programs have improved attainment rates for Indigenous students, but the gaps remain. Indigenous students need to see more Indigenous staff teaching and acting as mentors for them. Increased Indigenous presence encourages students to remain in school, increases teacher retention in remote areas, and encourages diversity and understanding. The effects of institutionalisation are still felt today. Education was used for assimilation and caused loss of culture, identity, and increased disconnect and social disadvantage. Many Indigenous students attend school with pre-existing disadvantage. They may live with substandard housing and inadequate nutrition, or have parents who receive little education and are unable to support their children's education. Education contributes to community well-being. If culturally sensitive education is unavailable, families feel alienated from school and retention levels fall. Retention and attainment rates are lower for Indigenous students and suspension rates are higher. Statistics show that students who do not complete high school are less likely to gain full-time work, and those failing at school are more likely to enter the justice system. These negative outcomes in early years directly affect their adult lives and contribute to ongoing cycles of disadvantage. Increasing school attendance is crucial to break these cycles. The overhauling of government policies and removal of colonial views in education are vital for this to happen. Although many policy reviews have taken place, recommendations are not always implemented. Statistics indicate that despite resources and funding, inequity in attainment remains. Reviews call for inclusion of the Indigenous voice in education. This can be achieved through community consultation and the introduction of culturally appropriate curriculums. Community groups are essential in supporting educational outcomes for Indigenous students. One example is the Stronger Smarter Institute. The Institute encourages students to be healthy and strong in cultural identity. It changes the way students experience education by increasing cultural relevance, and it has achieved significant educational improvements. By 2018, the Institute had reached 51,000 Indigenous students. Another community example is Queanbeyan South Public School. This school had elevated levels of disengagement and suspensions. With community consultation, they introduced a restorative justice called real justice, changing from punitive to restitutive practices. They built relationships with their community and introduced culturally appropriate teaching. Through this relationship development, their engagement levels rose and suspension and violence levels declined. According to the Indigenous education consultative bodies, the way forward is to deliver a nationwide system that is culturally appropriate for all Indigenous students and inclusive of their culture and languages. To improve outcomes, curriculums must be developed in partnership with Indigenous communities. By incorporating Indigenous history, languages and cultures, they believe that education in Australia can be improved for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. According to the Indigenous education consultative bodies, the way forward is to deliver a nationwide system that is culturally appropriate for all Indigenous students and inclusive of their culture and languages. To improve outcomes, curriculums must be developed in partnership with Indigenous communities. By incorporating Indigenous history, language and culture, they believe that education in Australia can be improved for Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. Resolution requires change, recognition of the disadvantage faced by Indigenous populations, the active engagement of Indigenous communities in education, and the continued financial and government support of Aboriginal education consultative groups to allow Indigenous communities to have a voice in education. Mark Rose echoed the Uluru Statement from the Heart by saying, "While Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders might have been recognised, we are still to be heard."